We now call on BYU's own John Hughes. I hope that most of you know John as the former editor of the Deseret Morning News for a decade before he returned to BYU as a professor of communications. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, former editor of the Christian Science Monitor, former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Public Affairs. He has an unprecedented background in the realm of international affairs, particularly as it pertains to public diplomacy. He's a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and he has won numerous awards for reporting. He writes a weekly column that's syndicated in, I don't know, several hundred newspapers, and so we're especially delighted to have John Hughes now talk about the broader international ramifications of the Afghanistan-Pakistan challenge. I might say, incidentally, Steve, that we can't call it PACAF because that's already taken by the Pacific Air Forces stationed in Honolulu. But we'll let you decide how you want to denote the area.
Well, it's traditional when a new president takes office for pundits to produce a report card on his first 100 days. Only a few weeks into his presidency, Mr. Obama attended one of those Washington dinners where the president is expected to make amusing and ideally self-deprecatory remarks about himself.
Can everybody hear? Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm a little offhand, but if I need to move over,
Yeah,
I can.
I think it'd be a good idea.
You think I should move over?
Yeah.
Okay. So President Obama was at this dinner, and he's very good at this kind of thing. He's actually very funny at these dinners. And he brought the house down when he told them that he thought he would spend his second 100 days setting up a foundation to celebrate the achievements of his first 100 days. Well, we're well past the first 100 days and the second 100 days of his presidency, and perhaps the president should wait for his second year in office to start tallying up the achievements of his first year. Unfortunately, while he promised change, he's become aware that bringing change to the ship of state is as cumbersome and slow as turning a giant ocean liner or an oil tanker around. Thus, although he seems to be everywhere, popping up daily on television, his elegant phraseology and soaring words of hope leave behind a formidable list of problems to be solved. At home, the economy is showing signs of upturn, but the jobless rate still teeters around 10% when the White House predicted it would flatten out at 7%. The housing market is awaiting a real rally. The president will probably get some health reform legislation passed this year, but without major features that he'd wanted, and with little Republican support to fulfill his promise of a bipartisan honeymoon. Meanwhile, we've not heard a whisper about the looming crisis in the Social Security system, or made much of a dent in global warming or progress on energy conservation. When the president was talked to in the presidential election campaign about his ability to simultaneously handle complex domestic and foreign affairs, he assured his critics of his multitasking prowess. But clearly in the area of foreign policy, the most awesome problem that he confronts is this whole question of Afghanistan. On that war, which he declared to be one of necessity, he faces an unenviable choice. He can honor the plea for more troops from the new commander that he installed to win the war, and who says that without the troops the war would be lost. That would infuriate the left wing of the Democratic Party and unnerve many Americans uneasy about a prolonged war. Or he can turn down General Stanley McChrystal and run the risk of being the president who lost Afghanistan and possibly Pakistan. The election redo is it's not going to change things very soon, I think, the election redo that is going to take place in Afghanistan. And I don't think the president is going to get much help from the international community, at least insofar as of adding more troops to Afghanistan. Defense Secretary Gates has been nudging NATO to engender more support. And at the recent NATO meeting, he did get some support from his colleagues in the military about support in Europe. That's support from Europe. But the fact is that the political leaders in Europe are still very skittish about getting involved in Afghanistan. There's one interesting new development involving the European Union. That's the 27-nation grouping that has been mainly concerned with trade and commerce. Ireland just voted in favor of the Lisbon Treaty, and that brings new legitimacy to the European Union. And it does an interesting thing. It obliged them to vote for a president and a virtual foreign minister, which they've not had before. Now, the odds-on favorite, while there are other candidates in the running, the odds-on candidate to become president of this 27-nation grouping is Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister, who supported President Bush a great deal in the Iraqi war, and who took a lot of heat from his own people as a result of it. But as he declared at the time, sometimes when you think you have to do something right, you have to take the unpopularity politically that goes with it. Now, Tony Blair, I think, is going to get, if he becomes president, is going to get a pulpit from which to preach. And he has made it no secret of the fact that he continues to be a favoring person on the intervention, both military intervention and for humanitarian reasons. So it's not at all clear how many of the 27 member states would sign on to President Blair's position, but nevertheless, I think it is something we need to keep in mind. President Obama has a really long, unfinished to-do list, and a lot of it is related in some way to Afghanistan. The Iraqi situation is extremely important. They're talking about their elections that are going to take place in January, in spite of the various terrorist bombings that have taken place recently and killed a lot of people, sadly. There's a lot of political jousting between the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shiites, but it's jousting that's taking place in Parliament and not out on the streets with Ka-47s. It may not be the kind of politicking that we do, but it is politics and democracy in the making. What eventually is determined to be the case in Iraq, if it is a democracy, it will not be the kind of democracy that we understand, nor necessarily is that an important thing. As the New York Times columnist Tom Friedman said about the importance of Iraq in a recent column, if we transform Iraq, it will impact the whole Arab Muslim world. If we change Afghanistan, it will just change Afghanistan. The other problems that the President faced, of course, is Guantanamo. He promised that it would be closed by the end of this year. I think that probably is not going to happen. On the question of Iran, it's not clear whether the talks just begun with the Iranians are a forerunner to a change of heart, which many of us suspect is unlikely, or merely postponement of a showdown while Iran speeds its clandestine development of nuclear weaponry. President Obama has warned against any Iranian foot-dragging, but the punitive measures available to us are rather few. Maybe some tougher economic sanctions, maybe with Russian support, but probably not from China, and certainly not before the end of the year. And even where Russia is concerned, it's difficult to see how you can count on them when their Prime Minister, when the President Medvedev says he might give some consideration to sanctions, and their Prime Minister, Mr. Putin, who clearly holds the reins of power in his hands, when Putin says they're not on. On North Korea, the regime of Kim Jong-il has successfully developed nuclear weapons and tested its rocketry without being given any pause by major power warnings or blandishments. It may be ready once again to talk, but like Iran, it has routinely lied while simultaneously developing nuclear weapons capability and engaging in protracted discussions. And surely, I think Iran is looking at the North Korean situation and saying, if the North Koreans can get away with it, so can we in Iran. On the overall question of permanent peace between Israel and the Palestinians, there's no progress between an obdurate Israeli Prime Minister, Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu, and a factionalized Palestinian populace. I hesitate even to bring up the issue of nuclear arms because I have two great experts on my right here, both General Jordan and Dr. Cohen are experts in that sphere. But I personally, while so many strange actors have nuclear weapons, I find it very unlikely that we are going to have a nuclear arms-free world in our lifetimes. And so there's the question of the war of terrorism, and certainly there has to be and will be a military component, a strong military component to that. But I think everybody has agreed, including the Secretary of Defense, who talked about this a great deal, that the war of ideas cannot go forward without soft power. And that's a mix of economic aid and what we call public diplomacy. And the sad fact is that our public diplomacy apparatus in this country is in serious disarray. Mr. Obama has made some extraordinary strides in some of the speeches he's given, from the speech he gave from Cairo, reaching out to the Muslim community. But although he is himself kind of a rock star internationally now, that has not changed most nations' feelings about American policy, or indeed American culture. And so I think we need to give some serious consideration to what has to happen. And I'm going to give you a little background to where we have been and where we sadly are in this whole area of public diplomacy. America has mobilized much manpower and material to protect its homeland and carry the fight to the enemy's remote lairs and hiding places. But it is the war of ideas that will ultimately determine whether moderate Islam, with which the United States has no quarrel, will prevail over Islamic extremism, whose perversion of Islamic faith is the problem. It's a contest in which the extremists are proving adept. From the remote terrain of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, they project their anti-American propaganda on Al Jazeera, picked up by CNN and other TV networks, and broadcast worldwide. Their production of material for television has become increasingly sophisticated. They've mastered the internet, Twitter, Facebook, social networking techniques. The now famous letter from Osama bin Laden's close lieutenant, Mr. al-Zawahiri, to al-Qaeda's #1 operative in Iraq, al-Zarqawi, who's now dead, made the strategy clear. More than half the battle is taking place on the battleground of the media. We are in a media race for hearts and minds. That's what al-Qaeda has as its object. Public diplomacy is the American weapon in this battle, rebutting falsehoods and projecting a truthful picture and explanation of American policies, culture, and freedoms. Traditional diplomacy is usually government to government, between diplomats confidentially or holding their cards close to their chests. Public diplomacy is open, usually through media seeking to persuade mass audiences or elites who are influential with mass audiences. And probably the best known American instrument over the years in public diplomacy has been the Voice of America, broadcasting by shortwave radio around the world. Launched in 1942, its first broadcasts were in German. Its first director was John Houseman. Its first message, "The news may be good or bad, we shall tell you the truth." And so it has over the years, while adapting itself to FM and medium wave radio, television, the internet, and new kinds of communication. Today it broadcasts in 45 languages to 134 million people. After the war, after World War II, and with the advent of the Cold War, President Eisenhower in 1953 authorized a new entity, the United States Information Agency. It embraced various existing government information units and built a powerful organization to counter Soviet propaganda and to tell America's story to the world. USIA, with the Voice of America operating under its aegis, mounted a formidable, multifaceted public diplomacy operation to implement its mission. It launched a daily wireless file to every American embassy, clarifying policy and containing information that diplomats could use in engagement with local opinion makers. It produced a serious publication, Problems of Communism, which reached scholars around the world. From its printing plants in Manila and Mexico City came a succession of colorful magazines about America in various languages. A Russian language edition became so popular in Moscow that Soviet officials clamped down on it and sent bundles back to the United States, claiming nobody wanted to read it. That made it a hot black market item for which ordinary Russians paid the equivalent of several dollars a copy. On the cultural front, USI, in tandem with the State Department, sent dance and musical groups, musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Benny Goodman around the world, and to Russia and its satellite nations in Eastern Europe wherever feasible. Among various educational and exchanging programs to Africa and the Middle East, USIA promoted a notable 1953 colloquium at Princeton of Islamic and American scholars, a very early recognition of the need to talk to the Muslim world. One of the most effective public diplomacy programs brought government officials and politicians, journalists and writers and artists and opinion makers from other countries for stays of varying length to observe America in all its strengths and weaknesses. USIA programmers targeted young politicians they thought would become leaders in their own countries over the years. Such individuals included Anwar Sadat, Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Hamid Karzai, and Gerhard Schroeder. It's tempting to ponder what impact, if any, such a visit to the United States in earlier days by Saddam Hussein might have made upon him. Operating abroad as USIS, the United States Information Service, USIA screened and distributed American movies and documentaries made by themselves, distributed to libraries set up in foreign capitals, libraries crammed with American books and newspapers and films. They also promoted big-ticket items like exhibits of American art and innovative pavilions displaying American products at international fairs. The famous kitchen debate between President Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev took place in 1905 at an American fair in Moscow. Almost 3 million Russians visited the American exhibits. Meanwhile, the Voice of America broadcast straight news bulletins around the clock in different languages to countries all over the world, despite Soviet attempts at jamming the signal. By law, the Voice of America was precluded from directing its programs internally to an American audience. But Americans could and can pick it up on a shortwave radio. My friend Scotty Reston, the New York Times columnist, did just that, tuning into the VOA's English language broadcast every evening. He told me it was his favorite newscast. In addition to news, there was back-of-the-book programming with debates and discussions, features on American life and culture. Country music was a hit in many lands, but an enormous audience tuned into Voice of America jazz programs. They were introduced with a recognizable Yankee Doodle Dandy jingle and hosted by an eccentric but knowledgeable jazz buff, Willis Conover, who became a legend behind the Iron Curtain. When he was eventually allowed to visit Poland, a crowd of thousands turned out to welcome him at the Warsaw airport. While VOA broadcast world news to a world audience, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were broadcasting to East Europe and Russia respectively. The mission of these radios was narrower. Staffed by many expatriates from their targeted countries, they were designed to gather factual information about what was happening in those countries and broadcast it back to peoples behind the Iron Curtain where censorship would otherwise bar them from hearing it. They were to the radio stations what citizens would hear in their own countries if they were free. The evidence is overwhelming that the work of these radio stations and Voice of America broadcasting to captive peoples played a significant role in keeping the concept of freedom alive behind the Iron Curtain. When Lech Walesa was asked after the events of 1989 if Radio Free Europe had played a role in the rebirth of freedom, he replied, "Would there be earth without the sun?" Czechoslovakia's Václav Havel made his statement symbolically. The day he took office as his country's new president, he went to the local offices of the Voice of America and said simply, "Thank you." When in the Reagan administration I became director of the Voice of America, I was moved to receive messages, sometimes by circuitous routes, from listeners in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Some would tell of creeping out into the birch forest in the winter snow to listen to Voice of America on a hidden shortwave radio. Wrote one man, "Your broadcasts from Voice of America keep the flame of liberty burning in our breasts." During political upheaval in the Soviet Union, Voice of America's reporters were trapped on the barricades of the Russian parliament. When using their cellular phones, they gave the world the first news of the depth of Russian resistance. Their reports went straight to the Moscow bureau of VOA, which beamed them live to VOA headquarters in Washington, which broadcast them instantly back to millions of listeners across the Soviet Union, buoying their spirits and stiffening their resolve. At the end of the Cold War, appropriately, there was a discussion in Washington about the continued value of the various radios, conceding that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty might ultimately be phased out. The task force maintained that they should be continued for years in a somewhat modified role. Instead of operating as surrogate radios to nations one under communist domination, they should offer alternative broadcasting to assist newly democratic nations to establish democratic institutions, particularly free and unfettered media. The value of this proposal was borne into us, when I was on a task force considering the future of radios, was borne into us in Munich when a senior Czech official dealing with the media met with our task force. He explained that during the Cold War, most Czech journalists had been communists, used to writing and broadcasting under authoritarian diktat. When the Cold War came to an end, they had difficulty in making the transition to a free press. At joint press conferences with the new American reporters in town, the Americans asked all the tough questions while the Czech reporters held back. Our Czech official said that he summoned the Czech reporters to his office and complained that the Americans were making the reticent Czech reporters look bad. He urged them to be more questioning of authority. The next press conference was initially better. The Czechs and the Americans both pressed the Czech official conducting the conference. After the conference was ended, the Czech reporters crowded into the official's office. Still steeped in their old ways of being instructed what to report, they said, "Okay, we've done what you wanted. Now what do you want us to write?" Insofar as the flagship VOA was concerned, the task force recommended substantially increasing funding and expanded resources for more shortwave broadcasting as well as transmission with new emerging technologies. During the darkest days of the Cold War, USIA was tasked to refute egregious examples of Soviet disinformation. I think that's what you must do in the current situation. When lies are told about the United States, you must answer them forcefully and skillfully. Some of the tactics that the Russians used against us were clever forgeries of State Department and other official documents, inventing bogus and damaging stories about U.S. activities. One fabricated story was that Americans were involved in an illegal Central American scheme to acquire children's body parts for sale to wealthy American recipients. Another fabrication was a news dispatch reporting that the American embassy in New Delhi housed a giant computer which had collected personal information about every citizen of India. Of course, it was a total fabrication. Yet another was that the United States had created the AIDS virus for use of a biological weapon. One of the most embarrassing public diplomacy setbacks for the Soviet Union occurred in 1983 when Soviet fighter pilots shot down a South Korean airliner, Flight 007, which had strayed briefly off course over Soviet territory. 269 passengers, including an American congressman, were killed in that event. I was at the State Department by that time as Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, and was summoned early in the morning to join Secretary of State George Shultz and Undersecretary Lawrence Eagleburger in the Secretary's office. They were in animated talk over early reports of the shoot-down. The Soviets were keeping silent, as they were to do for several days, after which they initially denied involvement. Our discussion revolved around what we knew and how we were to present our version of what had happened. Larry Eagleburger, a man of great passions, declared angrily, "They shot it down and we know it did." In his anger, I caught a reference to the tape. And I said, "What tape are we talking about?" Eagleburger disclosed that a top-secret monitoring unit outside the U.S. had recorded the Soviet pilots' chatter as they locked onto the Korean airliner. I said, "We have to play the tape." Mr. Eagleburger said, "Can't do it." Another government was involved, and even if that problem could be overcome, if we played the tape, the Russians would learn that we were monitoring their frequencies. They would change all of them, and an intelligence advantage would be lost. There followed a discussion between Larry Eagleburger and myself, which, as you can imagine, was rather heated. We debated the pros and cons in front of Secretary Shultz, but Larry Eagleburger was a great man and at a great moment. In the end, he agreed that the sensational political import of the tapes outweighed the loss of intelligence advantage. Within a day or so, we had the tape. We heard the Russian pilots communicating with their base, saying they had sighted the airliner, could see its flashing lights, had locked on, had fired, and the target is destroyed. USIA was called in to translate from the Russian and imprint English language subtitles and prepare it for presentation at a meeting of the United Nations Security Council. Huge monitoring screens were set up around the chamber. The world was stunned as UN Ambassador to the UN, Jean Kirkpatrick, played the dramatic tape in Russian, the words in English flashing across the screens. USIA, VOA, and the other government radios went on overtime, saturating the world's airwaves and media with the dramatic story. Izvestia's Alexander Shaldev, later in time, privately called it America's most devastating propaganda blow of the entire Cold War. That's what USIA officers and VOA people are doing around the world, making sure that the truth is relayed to millions of readers, listeners, and viewers. And innovative, inspiring as all the USIA and VOA programs were, much of the strength of US diplomacy lay in the talent of USIA public affairs officers stationed in the capitals and major cities of the world. Most were fluent in the languages of the countries they worked in. They were experienced practitioners of public diplomacy, well-versed in the policies of their own nation, and adept at communicating and explaining them. They had generally, over time, developed extensive contacts in media and politics in the lands they served. If a visiting American VIP was in town, they could generally introduce him or her to leading newspaper editors and TV directors, or arrange dinners with officials and thought leaders. In the cities in which they were stationed, they ran American libraries and cultural centers frequented by hundreds of students. They facilitated visits to the US by prominent politicians, journalists, writers, and artists. They masterminded return visits to those countries by American musicians and dance groups and performers. They were professional communicators with a passion for telling the American story. They were not hobbled by the bureaucracies of their embassies because they reported not to the State Department in Washington, but to area directors of their own agency, USIA, who shared and understood the overall mission. There was much maneuvering in Washington in 1997 involving the foreign affairs agencies of the government and their future. Republican Senator Jesse Helms sought to cut their cost, and the Clinton administration similarly looked for efficiencies. Although President Clinton protested there was no quid pro quo, Senator Helms met the Democrats' desire for passage of the Chemical Weapons Convention, and then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright offered up the folding of USIA, favored by Senator Helms. Transitional period of 2 years was set for the fusion of USIA with state, and in 1999, USIA became extinct as such. If there was apprehension about the wisdom of collapsing USIA into the State Department, it has proved well justified. Many veteran public affairs officers elected to retire, taking their years of expertise with them. Others who made the transfer found themselves assigned to State Department regional bureaus, reporting not to practitioners of public diplomacy, but to Foreign Service officers with little interest in or patience with public diplomacy. While Foreign Service officers were on fast tracks for promotion, the reassigned USIA officers were not. Overall, the USIA veterans found a prevalent State Department culture of disdain for public diplomacy. The budget for it was shredded. In foreign posts, USIA officers were no longer running their own information centers and libraries. They had to report to regular Foreign Service officers with different priorities. Often they were inundated with regular embassy matters and bureaucratic rules and protocols unrelated to public diplomacy. Well, with the terrorist attack on the United States of September 2001, America was suddenly confronted by the new and dangerous ideology of Islamist extremism. And US public diplomacy was ill-prepared to confront it with inadequate resources, poor leadership, and organizational ineffectiveness. In the intervening years, a series of government reports from the Government Accountability Office have raised major questions about public diplomacy's performance. And the latest one, in 2009, said that since the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the United States government has spent at least $10 billion on communication efforts, However, negative views towards the United States persist. The GAO was concerned about lack of coordination between the State Department and the Pentagon on public diplomacy. It was concerned about leadership of the State Department. The position of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy, it said, has been vacant for about 40% of the time since 2001. It was concerned about staff shortages in public diplomacy positions. The United States Embassy in Nigeria, with 800 employees, had only 3 senior officers, and public affairs were handled entirely by first-tour junior officers. It was concerned about language capability. 25% of public diplomacy officers in language-designated positions did not meet the language requirements in Arabic language posts. 36% of the public diplomacy positions were filled by staff unable to speak Arabic at the designated level. No question that the establishment of the position of Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy without status, without direct control of public diplomacy or officers or budget was highly questionable. To leave that position unfilled for substantial periods of time was incomprehensible. So what needs to happen, and when will it happen? It's not entirely clear when, during the course of the presidential election campaign, John McCain said that he thought that the collapse of public diplomacy, USIA, and its satellite radios was a terrible mistake, and that were he to be elected, he would resuscitate USIA as a separate agency to enforce a more vigorous public diplomacy. That was not the case with the Democrats. When Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, was asked about the future of public diplomacy, she said it would continue, did not require separate agency, and it would continue as part of the State Department. I think that although the military component is important, we've got to get serious about soft power, particularly public diplomacy. 1, we need to listen to foreign audiences before we preach. 2, public diplomacy needs a seat at the table when foreign policy is being crafted. You can't create global goodwill with bad policies. 3, USIA needs to be recreated as a separate agency from the State Department with all the skills needed to communicate in this new electronic era. 4, there needs to be a shake-up at the Broadcasting Board of Governors so that it exercises policy guidance but does not meddle in operational decisions of the radios. And finally, 5, resources need to be substantially increased. The Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, has been an interesting commentator on this, urging that more money be spent on public diplomacy and a little less on the Defense Department, which is an unusual situation for a Secretary of Defense. So resources need to be, which currently are just a smidgen of the Defense Department, need to be increased, and certainly there should be a lot more attention placed on public diplomacy. Joe, I think that's about where I am.
Thank you very much, John. We're going to take a short break now. We'll resume in 6 or 8 minutes for an extended question and answer period. We'll have the opportunity to bring the morning panelists up here so you can take shots at all 5 of them. And I welcome your comments as well as your questions. Thank you. John?